Welcome to the Blackwater Media Best of 2017 year-ending show. I'm Dr. William Lester. This broadcast special will feature some of the network's best shows from the past year. It will also feature some cool vintage radio commercials, so sit back, pour and sip, light it and smoke it. But most of all, enjoy. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I offer you a warm and hearty welcome to this most unusual abode, which is neither warm nor populated by living things with beating hearts. I'd like to offer up a little something for your consideration. A full moon, an isolated farmhouse, and the terror experienced by one man when he discovers that some of the old legends are in fact true. Incidentally, this is the Nightfall radio show, and our story is called By the Light of an OZARK Moon. On summer nights, when the heat lay like a woolen blanket over the OZARK forests and wrapped the hills with humidity, Grandmammy would sit on the front porch where she smoked, staring out over the fertile valley and sloping fields that led to the river. If it was the dark of the moon, she would tell funny stories and laugh with us. A crescent or half moon filled her with nostalgia. Her tales on those nights came from her childhood, but it was different if the moon waxed full. A full moon above the woodland is a majestic sight. The moonlight silvered the tall trees and made the rocks shimmer with that almost ghostly light, but I never found it beautiful because a full moon upset my grandmother. She was a brave woman. I've seen her kill copperheads with nothing more than a large rock or the sharp edge of her hoe. I once watched a tornado dance a destructive path across the valley, uprooting trees in its wake, and she did not flinch nor even seek the safety of the root cellar. She feared little, but the full-bellied moon struck terror into her heart. I did not understand why, not for years, but I knew, as did we all, that on nights when the moon was full she would turn maudlin and might weep. On those nights, despite her fears, my grandfather would always leave. I thought he went coon hunting, a common enough pastime in the OZARK woods, until I was about 10. I noticed that he did not take the hounds, Lucky and Shep, along, nor did he take his gun, and his buddies did not come to meet him on the ridge. I asked just once where he went on those bright nights, but Grandmammy made me no answer, and I lacked the courage to ever ask again. Her eyes held such agony, her mouth twisted with distress, and I could not question her about Grandpa's whereabouts again. I was there on the farm, more often in summer than in winter, but I recall that on those December nights when the moon swelled full, that Grandmammy huddled in a corner of the large living room, the television turned low. Although she stared straight ahead, she was not watching the fuzzy, snowy picture on the screen, nor was she gazing at the Christmas tree, a cedar cut down in the hills and carried in to be decorated with popcorn, paper garlands, and a tin-foil star. She always put me to bed earlier than usual on nights of the full moon, no matter how much I protested. In the summer, I lay awake long into the heated dusk and wondered where Grandpa went, but in winter, I curled beneath the quilts and slept, no matter how early she sent me upstairs. I may seem dense, but I never made the connection to the full moon and his absences. During the other moon cycles, he was a good grandfather. I toddled after him as he did his farm chores as soon as I could walk. He took me swimming on steamy summer afternoons down at the river, in the wide bend everyone called the swimming hole. I learned to float and later to swim there in those cold, clear waters. On occasion, a snake might swim past, but I wasn't afraid. He loved homemade ice cream, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and wore faded denim overalls. He was a farmer who tended to his cows, a father who raised his 6 children with a firm hand and loving heart, a husband who provided for his bride for almost 70 years. And he was a werewolf. Saying the word, even now, is very difficult for me. It is hard for me to match the man I loved so dearly, a man I modeled my life after, with the wild, snarling beast he became when the moon grew full. I might never have believed it but for the thing that happened, what I saw myself, and what I experienced. I was no longer a child. I was a man, married with a 2-year-old son and another on the way. Although I was not a farmer by trade, I had become an officer of the law, a highway patrolman with the state police. I was building my life on the foundations Grandpa built for me. Although past 90, he was still alive, and so was Grandmammy. They still lived on the farm, although the cattle were sold, and the fields would have grown up into brush if my uncle had not run his small herd into their pastures. As often as I could, I gathered my wife, Trinity, my son, Chase, and we went to the farm. Sometimes it was just a weekend visit, a brief trip back home, but on more than one vacation, we headed for the farm. Trinity griped because the farm was and is isolated. The old farmhouse lacked air conditioning, but the breezes that blew up the narrow river valley had cooled it for generations. Chase followed Grandpa as I had, and I did what I could around the farm to keep things up, fixing a fence, painting trim, and such. That autumn, my wife was 5 months pregnant with our second child, and she didn't want to leave the city for the farm. I had promised my grandparents that I would come, promised Chase that he would pick up walnuts in the October days, so my son and I came alone to the farm. Always before, I had made good time on the long drive out of Kansas City, but that Friday night I was running late. Because of a major traffic accident on one of the highways that feed into the city, I was late leaving my shift. By the time I arrived home, Trinity had supper ready, and already more than a little mad about my planned weekend trip, insisted that we eat before we left. We ate, and then we jumped into my pickup truck, another thing in which I aped Grandpa, and headed south. Dark fell long before we reached the Ozark Hills, but I didn't mind. A full harvest moon, orange as the pumpkins we would carve at Halloween, rose and illuminated the highway. It lit the countryside that we traveled through, and as I came down the long drive that led through the fields to the farmhouse, it bathed everything with a rich light. I will admit that I had all but forgotten Grandmammy's strange preoccupation with a full moon. Somehow our visits had been through no design in other parts of the lunar cycle, and so I thought nothing of the full moon. I admired, in fact, how lovely the farm looked in that light, how the farmhouse rose from the earth like something out of a Currier and Ives print. Chase was asleep, snug in his car seat as I rolled my Silverado to a stop around the back of the house. Several of the downstairs windows were alight with a cheerful glow, and I didn't realize that anything was wrong until Grandmammy rushed out of the back door. "Henry's not back!" The words burst out of her throat. She did not bother with a greeting. Past 90, she moved with slow steps most of the time, but that night she moved with the speed and grace of a much younger woman. "He went up into the woods 'fore dark, and he isn't back. You best get inside now." Worry crawled up the back of my neck. At 95, there were many things that could have happened to Grandpa, and none was very pleasant. As I mentally berated myself for not doing more to limit his activities around the farm, or urging them to move into the nearby town, I fumbled for the words. "Let me carry Chase in, and I'll go find him." I was not eager to go into the woods and search, but I saw no other alternative. Although I would be able to see with the moonlight in my service flashlight, I was worried about any lingering copperheads coiled on rocks to catch the fading warmth of the day. I was also, to be honest, afraid of what I might find. In my career, I've seen many dead bodies, most mangled in vehicle accidents, a few killed in cold-blooded murder. I'd faced death long ago, and while I didn't enjoy looking it in the eye, I really did not want to find my grandfather's body in the woods. I was about to suggest that we call for help from the local sheriff when Grandmammy spoke. "No!" That single word fell hard between us. "No, Greg, you won't. You'll come in this house and we'll lock the door. You can't go after him, not now, not after dark has fallen." Although I had believed her to be of sound mind despite her advanced age, I wondered if I had been wrong. As I unstrapped my son from the car seat and carried him into the house, I questioned her. "Don't you want me to go find him? He may be sick or hurt or—" "No." She shook her head back and forth with force. "He may well be, but you can't go after him. Not until morning." "But he might be—" I didn't want to say the word. She had no such compunction. "Dead?" "Yes, son, he might well be dead by then, but if you go now, you may be as well. He's not dead just yet." I wondered how she could know, or think she knew, but then I stopped halfway through the back door as a strange sound rippled the still night air. The howl sounded angry. It sounded almost human, and yet something like a wolf. Perplexed, I looked at my grandmother. She, frail and feeble, took my son from my arms and said, lips tight, "I'll put the boy to bed and then I'll tell you what I should have told you before." I waited, uneasy, listening as her footsteps clumped up the stairs. I knew each creak of the floor, and it seemed like a very long time until she returned, winded. Her face had the harsh lines of a carved mask, something Native American or even African. As she settled down into her old armchair, she reached for a cigarette. "Grandmammy, you quit smoking years ago." I was shocked. She'd given up smoking after her 70th birthday. Her aged lips clamped tight on the unfiltered Lucky, and she lit it with a match. "For what I have to tell you, Greg, I need a cigarette. You won't believe me, but please don't think I'm a crazy old woman. What I'm going to tell you is true." Her smoke made me cough as I asked, "What is it?" In her matter-of-fact, everyday tone, she said, "Henry's a werewolf. Been one since he was a boy of 12. It's a secret I've carried for many years, and a secret I hoped never to tell anyone." I could not believe her. A werewolf? Please, I thought as I tried to banish the image of a late-night movie where an old gypsy woman warned a werewolf. "Oh, Grandmammy." I thought I understood now. She had lost her mind, and I tried to find a plan that would both help her and find my grandfather. She shot me a look that curdled my heart, a hard, knowing look I'd never seen on her face before. "I knew you wouldn't believe me, but it's so. I knew when I married him. He told me the night before we wed, but I loved Henry, and so I married him anyway. I moved here to this farm, and 'twas his own mother taught me what to do when the spells come on him. His daddy had made a place in a cave up on the hill, a place where Henry could go and shut himself into when the moon was full. When he was a little boy, they locked him in, but by the time I knew him, Henry put himself into the cave. At first, his daddy was the one to go let him out in the morning, but soon it was me. I've done it for all these years, rain or shine, wet or cold. I could not imagine that there was a cave on the farm. I knew, or thought I did, every foot of the woods and the farm. I played along, though, to buy time so that I could help my grandparents. Then he isn't locked up tonight?" Her sigh echoed in the room, and she blew smoke out of both nostrils with a snort. "No, he's getting slower these days, and he wasn't out of the yard yet when the moon rose. I ain't watched him turn in years, but I saw him tonight, changing from a man into a werewolf. If you don't believe me, his clothes lay on the ground out by the little barn. You heard him howl, same as me, didn't you?" I was cold, colder than I'd ever been, and my hands trembled. She made it sound so possible, so plausible, but I couldn't admit the truth. "I heard a coyote." It didn't sound like a coyote, though, but it must be. There were no such beings as werewolves, and if there were, Grandpa could not be one. "Nope, you heard Henry. He's out there running wild in the woods, howling and doing God knows what. He may kill some stock, I hope no more than that, because he's a beast, a raging beast. No man can stop him tonight, not unless they have a silver bullet." I looked around the comfortable living room I knew so well, and it had not changed. The same vintage furniture, that hurricane lamp she had always had, and the prints on the wall had faded, but were the same I remembered from my childhood. Yet everything I knew and believed had changed, and I realized nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, I felt out of kilter, so out of sync with life that I wanted to scream, to howl myself like an animal. And in that moment, I began to believe that perhaps my grandfather could be a werewolf after all. If someone stops him, won't they kill him? I had to know. Yes, but he may have to be stopped. I've always known that. 2 tears, one on each side of her face, rolled down toward her chin, and I wanted to cry myself. Grandmammy, I'm beginning to believe this crazy thing, I told her. But I have to know how he became a werewolf. She lit a second lucky strike from the end of the one she had smoked down to the butt. I asked myself years back. When Henry was a little boy, he liked to prowl the woods, sometimes at night. He come home one night saying a wolf bit him. That was around 1920. His folks cleaned the wound, washed it out with whiskey, and thought he would be fine. Biggest worry they had was rabies, but when the moon come full again, he turned into a werewolf. I listened, feeling like I must be having a nightmare, that I would wake up back in the townhouse with Trinity beside me. But the smell of the tobacco smoke, the feel of the rump-sprung couch under me screamed reality. It was true then, a terrible truth, and I wondered just why Grandmammy had told me. Then I realized that she had been worried about chasing me, afraid in case Grandpa roared out of the dark to bite us or even kill us. Her fear was born out of love. You were worried he might attack us, I said, hating each word as I forced it up my dry throat. We're safe now inside the house with you. And Grandpa, he'll be all right in the morning, won't he? I should have known that there would be more. Something else even more terrible than the bare knowledge that my beloved grandfather was a werewolf. But I did not, and I wasn't prepared. No, he won't, Grandmammy said. Another undulating howl outside, close enough to make the window glass tremble and raise the hair on the back of my neck. He would have been if he'd got to the cave in time, but since he ain't, he'll smell our blood. He'll come for us, Greg, unless you stop him. My mind froze, blanked out, and I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she asked me to do. When I understood, I began to shake, to tremble, and to feel a rising nausea twist my stomach into knots. My grandmother, a strong woman, who had succored me and given much to my raising, was asking me to kill my grandfather. If I hadn't already been certain, the sight of the single silver bullet she pulled from her pocket would have convinced me. I rebelled against the idea that I could kill the grandfather that I had loved, shoot him through the heart with this absurd silver bullet, and told her, I can't kill Grandpa. I can't. You've killed before. Her tone was no nonsense and firm. And God help me, she was right. I'd shot 3 perps in my career. One, a drug-crazed man who threatened to kill his infant daughter. Another, a man who rushed me with a knife on a dark road. And the last, a young man who had shot the man who had hit his wife's car head-on and then turned to shoot me in his grief-induced insanity. Those deaths were in the line of duty. The dead were strangers, and I had shot to defend myself. Killing my grandfather was something quite different. I have, but it's different. Grandmammy rose, her aged bones creaking as she pulled herself upright. Her gnarled, worn fingers pushed the bullet into the palm of my hand and wrapped my reluctant fingers around it. No, it's not. He will kill me, kill you, and kill your son before he's done. The bloodlust is on him now, Greg, and he won't stop. He may be an old man in life, but he's powerful strong as a werewolf. Grandpa would want you to kill him before he hurt any of us. You know that, and if you don't, well, we talked about it some years ago. I can't. Even as I spoke, I realized that I could, that killing him would be as much an act of love as defense. I thought of my small son upstairs, his tender body that would crunch beneath the werewolf's fangs, and I steeled myself to do what must be done. Better to end Grandpa's long torture as a werewolf now than wait until one of us lay dead. Better to kill him before he might make my son another werewolf. My revolver is in the car, I said, my words choking up through repressed tears. I'll get it. Grandmammy nodded. Best load it right off in case you need it. 1,000 stars sparkled overhead, paled by the strong light of the full moon. I reached into the truck and grasped my weapon, chambered the silver bullet, and turned at the sound of something large running. I cannot call that thing Grandpa, came out of the woods. A tall, strong beast, at least 7 feet tall. Thick, coarse, dark brown hair covered the body. The mouth snarled at me, growling, and I saw the teeth, terrible fangs stained with rich red blood. As it jumped at me, lunged toward me, I aimed my weapon and fired one shot. I did not miss. I'm a noted sharpshooter, and the shot found its mark. At the moment of impact, the creature screamed, a horrible, anguished sound that made my blood run cold. Tears slicked my cheeks, and I realized that I cried out too. My wordless cry of grief, of pain, of terror came when the yellow eyes altered, shifted, and became my grandfather's familiar brown eyes. I watched as the fur faded, leaving a naked old man's body, gaunt and pitiful in the moonlight. He was dead, and the rest of the truth came to me then. I would answer for this in the bright light of day, for shooting my grandfather through the heart, and no one would ever believe what I knew was true. He was a werewolf. And that concludes another excursion into the darkness on the Nightfall radio show. Thank you for listening to the program. The Nightfall radio show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. If you enjoy the show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to submit a short story, poem, or artwork, email your submission along with a brief bio to nightfallradioshow@mail.com. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. I'll see you again at Nightfall.
Hello, amigo. I'm Chiquita Banana, and I've come to say bananas have to ripen in a certain way, and when they're flecked with brown and have a golden hue, bananas taste the best and are the best for you. You can put them in a salad, you can put them in a pie, any way you want to eat them. It's impossible to beat them, but bananas like the climate of the very, very tropical equator. So you should never put bananas in the refrigerator. To have bananas that are fully ripe, you must be absolutely sure to take them home and let them ripen at indoor temperature.
Oh, sure.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Welcome to the Historian's Almanac. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. On this edition of the program, Kenneth Arnold's 1947 UFO sighting. Although the history of UFOs can be traced back to early cave drawings, pictures, and folklore, the modern era of the study of UFOs is usually believed to be the 1947 sighting report of 9 flying saucers made by pilot Kenneth Arnold on June 24, 1947. Arnold was aiding in the search for a missing plane when the sightings occurred. He did not believe his story would be believed, but swore that it was true. Arnold related his sighting to the Chicago Daily Tribune. The first thing I noticed was a series of flashes in my eyes as if a mirror was reflecting sunlight at me. I saw the flashes were coming from a series of objects that were traveling incredibly fast. They were silvery and shiny and seemed to be shaped like a pie plate. What startled me most at this point was that I could not find any tails on them. Arnold estimated that the objects were flying at an altitude between 9,500 and 10,000 feet and at great speed. After clocking them from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams, he arrived at an estimated speed of 1,200 miles per hour. It seemed impossible, he said, but there it is. I must believe my eyes. The term flying saucer was coined, not by Arnold, but a reporter. Arnold made the statement that the objects moved like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. East Oregonian newspaper reporter Bill Biquette paraphrased Arnold's statement when he placed the story on the AP Newswire. Arnold's term, saucer-like, became flying saucers. The U.S. military attempted to ignore the press reports of Arnold's sighting, but as the story grew, they felt compelled to take action. A meeting to discuss a course of action was held at the Pentagon on July 7, 1947, only a few days after the events in Roswell, New Mexico. Taking charge was Chief of the Army Air Force Air Intelligence Requirements Division, General Shulgin. The group made the decision to follow up on qualified observers' reports of flying discs. 3 days later, Arnold received a request from Continental Air Command to appear for an interview regarding his report. 2 counterintelligence corps investigators would carry out the investigation. The results of this session were included in Project Blue Book. Arnold's report was one of the first of 850 different UFO reports to make U.S. media by the end of July 1947. More than anything else, Arnold was in the right place at the right time to forever be an important part of the history of UFOs. That concludes another edition of the Historian's Almanac. Thank you for listening to the program. I'd like to invite you to listen to my other program, Agenda Earth, with my co-host, Mark Zaski. That program can be heard on the Crypto Reality YouTube channel, the Crypto Reality Facebook page, and the Agenda Earth Facebook page. The Historian's Almanac can be heard on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel and the Historian's Almanac Facebook page. I'm Dr. William Lester, reminding you that history comes alive on the Historian's Almanac.
Men, no shaving proposition beats this. Listen. There's $1 cash, says Colgate Brushless wins you in a flash. Yes, $1 cash says this is it for the clean, smooth, comfortable shaves you've always wanted. And here's why.
Because it's light and fine-textured, Colgate Brushless completely surrounds, softens, and supports each bristle better than greasy, heavy creams. There's no matting down. There is no clogging. Your razor doesn't skid or skip when you use Colgate Brushless. Instead, it cuts through clean and smooth.
Try Colgate Brushless. See how it does away with razor scrape and soreness. Discover how slick and smooth and downright comfortable it makes your shave.
Get a large or giant-sized tube or jar of Colgate Brushless Shaving Cream. If 1 week's use doesn't win you completely, just send me back the carton top and we'll mail you your $1. Address, Bill Stern, care of Colgate, Jersey City, Zone 2, New Jersey. Remember, there's $1 cash says Colgate Brushless wins you in a flash. Real 5.
Abizanda, Spain, September 29th, 1992. We drove a few miles and parked at the crest of a bluff overlooking a series of mostly barren fields. There was little greenery save the occasional patch of scrub. The sun had already sunk beneath the rim of the world. My companion Sergio revealed from a case a 6.5 by 54 caliber Mannlicher Schnauer. Looking out across the landscape, he said to me, "Now we will wait." We waited there on the bluff for what seemed like hours, but I realized later that no more than 20 minutes had expired before the most horrific sound I had ever heard came rushing across the landscape. It was not exactly a howl, nor was it a scream. It was, upon reflection, a preternatural wail heralding the fulfillment of a curse. Sergio advised me to take my field glass and look to the left at about 75 yards. My field of vision was illuminated by an impossibly bright full moon. So was the view through the scope of Sergio's rifle. As the baneful wail began to echo down to nothing, I saw it. I saw it running at a tremendous speed. I could even make out the dust kicked up by clawed feet ripping across the ground. Although clearly inhuman, I could detect the vestiges of clothing, ripped, torn, and flailing in the air stirred by the motion of the thing. It took large, loping strides, and strangely, its arms barely moved, as if it were unnecessary for generating torque. It was at just that moment of my contemplation that Sergio fired a shot. The shot shook me to my core. Yet I saw the bullet strike and take the thing to the ground. Then, to my horror, it rose again, in what were mere moments. I watched as it quickly resumed its surreal digitigrade loping across the dark landscape. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That shot through the midsection would have killed any man ever born, and yet this monstrosity was knocked down by nothing more than the force of the bullet. Then Sergio fired again. The second shot struck the thing in the upper arm or shoulder, for I saw the ragged shirt flare upon impact and a patch of it blew off. The beast did not fall this time, but was pushed by the strike only momentarily before it continued its mad sprint. Sergio got off one more round before the thing finally dashed out of our field of vision. Again, that terrible wail exploded in the darkness all around us. I realized that we were now vulnerable to an attack from virtually any direction. Would the Wolfman seek escape, or, as I feared, seek to exact vengeance upon us? Certainly, if Sergio's rifle had failed to stop the beast, there was little hope of success in a hand-to-hand confrontation. In any other situation, we would have been more than a match for an assailant. I was 24 years old at the time. Although Sergio was 10 years my senior, we were both well over 6 feet tall and easily capable of giving a good account of ourselves. We agreed, however, with a glance and a nod, that indeed discretion was the better part of valor. As we headed back to the Jeep, I found myself muttering and musing aloud. What in God's name was that? And Sergio replied in a rare smattering of English. Nothing in God's name. That was the hombre lobo. We came to learn that the monstrous fiend that haunted the hills, woods, and quiet roads amongst the villages was a wolf man, a thing quite different from the so-called werewolf of legend. It was a man, cursed, possessed as it were by a bestial dark spirit that waged war with the soul of the man it sought to subdue and imprison. As such, the demon was brought to the fore when the forces of evil were at their strongest, especially in conjunction with the coming of the full moon. Unlike the natural wolf, the murderous abomination walked on 2 legs, at times even adorned the shredded remnants of the man's clothing. Strangely, until the time of the blood moon, the eyes retained a saddened human quality. We learned from the villagers that the burning of sulfur was prone to keeping away wolves. The scent permeated the air in the village square and the adjoining pathways. One night we ventured out against strenuous admonitions to investigate the strange happenings. This was the night that I was to experience the preternatural reality of the horror that has haunted me these many years. What I witnessed that night has never left me, and the nightmarish visage is a constant companion. It reminds me that at times, that the devil does indeed walk the earth. The following is an excerpt from the journal of Sergio Morales. Last night the thing appeared in the field below the village. The professor, too, witnessed the creature. I am sure now that he is convinced, as I have been for some time, that this was an unnatural thing. 3 times my rifle found its target, and yet the howling devil endures. I spoke today with Senor Abizanda and Sergeant Gomez. They have agreed to consult with the professor. Is it possible that together we can rid this village of its terrible curse? The body of night watchman Jose Mancilla was found inside his small 2-room office building on the morning of October 1st. He had been beaten and pummeled with unimaginable force. His face and throat had been ripped and torn as if by the claws of a raving beast. Abizanda was a small hamlet, and the word of the horror spread like the plague. Item: the previously installed security camera revealed a brief moment of the deed, but little more. The tape itself was viewed by local officials before being secreted away. Item: the killer was possessed of incredible strength. The metal door, locked and bolted from the inside, had been forcefully pulled from the hinges and slung 30 feet. Item: the momentary flash of activity revealed by the tape indicated that the killer was in fact the same impossible monstrosity recently witnessed by Sergio and myself dashing across the fields below the town. This is as much as I dare reveal to you here. Suffice it to say that such horrors exist in this world. Though I wish it were not so, failure to disclose the reality of such things would for me be the highest form of hypocrisy. I've seen it. I've witnessed it, and it has been like a plague of nightmares upon me since those long ago days. So what do you think? There may perhaps be as many reactions to this experience as ears that hear it. I am therefore quite content to leave the burden of final judgment to you. If what you've heard horrifies or shocks you, and has forever changed your concept of reality, allow me to offer you one small glint of relief. Tell yourself, as I have day after day, night after night, that it's only a story. If you can do that much, you can convince yourself that behind the safety of your door, in the quiet of your bed, that it couldn't happen here.
Light up a cremo, a mellow, mild cremo, a winning smoke by far. You can search every clime, but at 3 for a dime, you can't beat a cremo cigar. But at 3 for a dime, you can't beat the cremo cigar. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the Sweet-Scented Cigar-Smoking Society. This is Arthur Godfrey down in Washington, D.C. Mike Man Godfrey, Cremo's capricious custodian of the calorific cantata.
Hello and welcome. It is indeed a pleasure to see you all once again. Your presence here is indeed a credit to your courage and constitution. Down through the ages, sages and scholars of many sorts have advised vigorously against dabbling with and the conjuring of spirits. You see, you can never really be sure about exactly what it is you're communicating with, and in such a set of circumstances, it's almost never good. Our tale tonight is one such example of a vile entity, gone renegade in our world, and you may rest assured that its sole objective is your destruction. The title of our story is The White Demon, and fortunately for you, I've managed to contain it here on the Nightfall radio show. We all have darkness inside of us, the depth of which is determined by the measure of those things from which it was created. The darkness inside of my family is an abyss, and the screams that come from the other side of that darkness is an endless haunting inside my head. Everything I am about to tell you is true. It began with a dream, though a more appropriate description would be nightmare. I woke abruptly to the screams of children. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I could feel my heart racing, feeling as if it would beat out of my chest. As I looked around the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, I could see my sister, Missy, 5 years my senior, in the other bed fast asleep. Why didn't the screams wake her, I wondered. Missy, in a loud whisper across the room. Missy, wake up. The words sounded muffled in my head like I was talking into a can. During my futile attempts to wake her, I caught a glimpse in my peripheral vision of a shadow moving past the doorway and down the hall on the second floor. Slowly, as if I were navigating an imaginary minefield, I crept to the doorway. As my bare feet left the soft rug and found the hardwood floor in the hallway, I saw the shadow leave the landing of the staircase and go down the stairs. I crept down the first 6 steps of the landing, peeking around the banister down the next flight of stairs. At the bottom, I saw the shadow and realized it was not a shadow at all, but more of a black mist. It had no shape, no features, but I knew it was staring at me. It moved without touching the floor, down around the corner of the stairs, and I followed. As I reached the first floor, I was very cautious and quick to move away from the living room, which was to the right of the staircase, and into the den to the left. Pahu was in the living room resting on the piano. No one in our family, at least the kids, wanted anything to do with being in the same room with Pahu. His is a story for another time. As I rumbled into the den, I saw the thing on the other side of the glass pane swinging door that led into the dining room and kitchen, but the door had not moved. It was as if the black thing had gone through it. As I went into the dining room and to the left into the kitchen, I knew immediately where this thing was leading me, to the pantry, where there was a door to the basement. The wood door was very old and heavy, with a skeleton key lock, always very cold to touch. I first found that out playing hide and seek with my cousins, finding a great spot beneath the bottom counter of preserves my grandmother jarred by herself. I would lean my back against the door and notice how cold it felt against my shoulder, almost as if there was ice on the other side of it. Once, when Tommy, one of my cousins, found me and we let out a loud bit of laughter, my grandfather stormed into the pantry. "What are you kids doing?" he shouted in his deep voice and his arms cocked by his side like he was ready to fight. "Nothing, Grandpa. We're just playing hide and seek," Tommy said. "Did you try to open that door?" He peered into our eyes, assessing us for lying. "No, sir," I said. "It's locked." "Yes, it is locked," he said firmly. "And you kids are never to try to open that door. Do you understand me?" Nodding, Tommy asked, "Grandpa, what's down there?" He turned back, and if looks were lasers, there would have been a hole in Tommy's head. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," was said back in chorus. He left us standing in the pantry with even more curiosity than before. As I entered the pantry, I could see that the door was open and the screaming was getting louder. It sounded like the screams of several kids who couldn't have been much older than me by the pitch of their sounds. I looked into the basement, down the stairs, and though it was black, there was a faint lightness below. I began down the steps, and the room was cold. With each step down, it got colder and the screams became louder. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I could make out nothing in the thick blackness. Out of nowhere, the face of a girl lunged at me. Not much older than me at 10, her eyes were wide, tears welling up around them, a look of panic on her face. Hair disheveled, her skin had a pallor about it that I had only seen at my great-grandmother's open casket funeral, when for the first time I had gazed upon a corpse. I felt her frigid hands touching, grasping for me, fingernails clawing at my cheek. It began to sting instantly. Jumping backward, I felt the hands of others reaching out of the darkness, pulling on my pajama shirt on one side, the other on my arm. These hands were cold and pale. The nails and fingertips were very dirty, as if they had been clawing at the earth. Perhaps it could have been dried blood. Too difficult to tell in the dark. Then I felt another set of hands tugging at my pants leg, icy fingertips sliding down the cloth to the top of my bare feet. I could feel cool, damp concrete, the floor beneath me. "Please," she pleaded, "please make them stop. Please help us." She vanished as abruptly as she'd appeared, as if something snatched her back into the blackness. Desperate, shrieking screams mixed with cries for help. Yet while I could not see anything, I knew they were all girls. I couldn't tell how many, but knew there were more than 2 or 3 by the number of different pleas uttered simultaneously. I knew at the very least 4 sets of hands had touched me. As I began to back up, I leaned over, stretching out my neck, as if that would help my vision cut through the darkness, and that was when I saw his face. Smooth as glass, white as snow, black circles around his eyes. I realized as I surveyed his face it was because they were sunken deep into the recesses of his head. His nose was long and had the slight pointedness to it. His eyes, a slight tint of yellow, where white should have been, no color to the iris. It was completely black as the coal that Grandpa put in the stove in the mornings to take the chill off the den. His lips were nearly colorless, cracked and dry. Leaning over me, his sinister-looking grin revealed abnormally large teeth, appearing very sharp, like gazing at a yellow saw blade inside his foul mouth. I realized I was no longer in the cellar. Back in my bed on the second floor, this ghastly creature in my face leaned closer. The stench I could smell on his breath stunk of rotten meat. What I thought was smooth skin was actually covered with tiny scales. Raising a finger to his lips, it was long, crooked, slender, and also covered in scales. Puckering his parched lips, sound that emerged from them was deafening. Shh! It whistled through my mind. I knew a hideous creature was not telling me to hush, as I remained silent in its presence. Instead, it was warning me to keep my mouth shut about what I had seen. It was a threat. Suddenly, the screaming in my head stopped abruptly, and I sprang up in bed. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. I could see Missy still sleeping in her bed across the room. Daring to move, I went into the hallway, but only dim light from the bathroom illuminated the night. Listening, peering through shadows, awaiting the sounds of children I had seen in the cellar, I heard nothing. Back in my bed again, the light came on. Missy was standing beside me, leaning down over me, both hands on the bed. My sister was staring at me. "What are you doing, Jimmy?" "Nothing," I said. I guess I just had a bad dream." "Well, stop screaming before you wake everyone," she said. She leaned her head forward and squinted her eyes. "What happened to your face?" "What?" I asked as my hands went to my cheeks. "Your face. You've got scratches." She reached out to trace the marks on my face, lightly touching the skin, then looked at me accusingly. 3 claw marks on my face stung as the tips of my fingers found them. I must have scratched myself." "Go back to sleep," Missy said as she went back to her bed, leaned over and turned the lamp off. "Missy," I said, "can we leave the light on?" "Oh my God," mumbling beneath her breath, she tugged on the chain of the lamp, dimly illuminating the bedroom. Before turning back, she said to me, "Don't worry, he won't be back tonight." He? I thought to myself. He who? What the hell was she talking about? Had she seen the monster in the room? Was it real? My fingertips once again found the scratches on my face. They still stung to the touch. "Missy," I whispered, no answer. "Missy," I loudly breathed, but she was already fast asleep. I did not return to slumber that night. Instead, I propped my head up on the pillow so I could see the entire room and pulled the blanket all the way up to my chin, as if to provide security from anything that would try to threaten me. Sleep eventually reclaimed me. It finally pulled me back, but it was not deep or peaceful. When I awoke the next morning, Missy was sitting on the side of her bed, brushing her long, dark hair, as she did every morning. I was relieved. Everything looked normal around the room. A dream. I nervously laughed at myself. It was only a terrible dream. As I looked back to Missy, she put the brush down on the bedside table. Slowly walking towards me, her eyes squinted as if straining to see something. "They're gone," she said. "What? What's gone?" I knew what she was talking about. "The marks," she said. "You were bleeding from scratches last night. The 3 marks on your cheek. They're gone." My hand went to my face. First one side, then the other. No stinging, no scratches. They were gone. "You saw him, didn't you?" Missy leaned toward me, spoke softly in a lighter voice as if others were listening outside of the room. "What?" My brow frowned. I was confused. How could she have known? "What? Who?" I felt dizzy. The room felt like the tilt-a-whirl at the state fair, and nausea was beginning to overcome me. "I don't know. The white monster? Whatever he is, but he's not a man. But he's taken others there." Missy knew. My mouth opened, but I couldn't find any words to speak. "Me, Jane, Brett, Terry, and I'm pretty sure Tommy, but he won't talk about it. We've all seen him, and we've all heard the girl screaming." "They were cold," I blurted out. "They were cold and pale, like Granny was at her funeral, and their hands were like ice, and they kept grabbing and tugging on me." "What? You saw them?" "I don't think any of us have ever seen them, just heard them screaming." It was surreal what I was hearing from my sister, what I was recalling. There was no way that it could be real, but I knew that my dream was no dream at all. The white monster haunted us for years to come, and it was only later in life that we discovered who he was, what he was, what he was doing in the cellar, who the girls were, and what was causing their frightening screams. However, that is a story my family does not wish to tell. Unfortunately, I cannot claim that this was the last time any of us saw this demon in our sleep. And that concludes another excursion into the darkness on the Nightfall radio show. Thank you for listening to the program. The Nightfall radio show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. If you enjoy the show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to submit a short story, poem, or artwork, email your submission along with a brief bio to nightfallradioshow@mail.com. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. I'll see you again at Nightfall.
The kitchens of today can be more beautiful than 1949 because this year there's a better, brighter, self-polishing floor wax. It's 1949 Glow Coat. Yes, bright as it's always been, this year Glow Coat is brighter than ever, better than any. Try 1949 Glow Coat on your linoleum this week.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you all join me once again. I hope that each of you somehow, someway are able to make yourselves comfortable. But I doubt if that's a real possibility, especially when you learn what's in store for you. Tonight, we visit the continent of Africa, birthplace of civilization and of mankind itself. It is a place steeped in legend, lore, and myth. These, of course, occasionally intersect with the darkest nightmares imaginable. Our tale tonight is one such example. I offer you now the Vampire of Kari Hall, who, by the way, has recently taken up residence on the Nightfall radio show. Kari Hall in Shindam, Nigeria, had been owned by a family named Sonsoro for well over 100 years. But at the end of the last century, they moved out to a larger estate in Zungeru and rented the house out to two brothers, Rano and Tarka Azari, and their sister Dia. The threesome settled comfortably into the house and soon made many friends in the surrounding area. One hot day in the middle of July, the sultry air made any kind of work impossible, so the three had an early supper. Afterward, they had all sat out on the porch, relaxing in the cooler air, and watched the beautiful full moon rise and wash the lawn in silver light. After a few hours, they grew tired and went indoors, each to their separate rooms. Dia found the night still too warm to sleep. She rose and opened her shutters, returned to the bed, mounted her pillows behind her, and sat up in bed, watching the moon through her ground floor window. After a time, she began to feel herself drifting off when she became aware of two tiny lights that seemed to flicker in and out of the row of trees that separated Kari Hall's lawn from the village mosque yard beyond. At first, they seemed little more than fireflies, but as Dia continued to stare at them, they drew nearer. She saw to her surprise that they appeared to be enclosed in a dark mass of shadow, which had somehow broken away from the moon-cast shadows beneath the trees. Dia's hand went to her throat as she realized that something was approaching the house, and growing larger the nearer it came. She noticed that every few moments the dark mass was engulfed by the shadows of trees on the lawn. But then the mass always re-emerged, larger than the previous moment, and always coming closer and closer. Closer. Dia became filled with horror and felt as though she would cry out, but her throat felt paralyzed. Then she realized that any noise that she might make would almost certainly draw the attention of the thing outside. Then she realized something else. Whatever was out there would surely not be stopped by a barrier of glass panes and thin wooden sashes. Then suddenly the mysterious shape turned aside as if it were going around the other side of the house. As soon as Dia determined that the menacing figure was out of sight, she leaped from her bed and ran to the hall door. But when her fingers grasped the cool brass knob, she heard a blood-chilling scratch at the window. When she turned, she beheld a hideous pale face with burning red eyes glaring back at her. The creature began rattling the windows, which were locked from the inside. For a hopeful instant, and only that long, Dia believed that the doors might actually keep the thing at bay. But as the rattling grew into a more fervent attempt at entry, Dia resigned to the fact that escape might be a more viable alternative. She tried to open the bedroom door to flee out into the hall beyond, but the antique handle jammed, leaving her trapped in the room. The creature outside began scratching on the glass, pecking its talon-like nails on the frail panes. Then it started ripping away the lead frames which held the glass in place. Dia tried to scream, but fear would only allow a pitiful moan to escape from her lips. Then, one single diamond-shaped pane fell inward and shattered on the floor. An incredibly long, spiny finger slunk through and found the latch on the window and threw it open. Now possessed only by the most potent horror, Dia jumped from the bed to which she had retreated upon discovering the jammed door. She hoped to reach the closet, but her resolve was too little, too late. The thing exploded into the room, grabbed her by the hair with its bony fingers, and flung her down onto the bed in such a way that her head hung over the side. Then, in a moment of savage cunning, evil, and terror, the thing bit her on the throat. The stinging pain released her voice, and she at last began to scream. As she fought and struggled to push the monstrous form away from her, she could hear her brothers shouting and pounding on the door. When Rano and Tarka saw that the door would not budge, they slammed themselves against it, throwing it down by sheer force. Inside, they found their sister bleeding from the wound in her throat and unconscious. They looked outside past the open window and saw nothing. Suddenly, Rano shouted, "I see him!" He pointed to the tall figure that fled from the shadows under the large Iroko. Without hesitation, he pursued it, but the creature moved incredibly fast, with long, loping strides, and leaped over the wall into the mosque yard. By the time Rano had reached the fieldstone wall, he saw nothing save the gravestones and vaults. The thing, whatever it was, had vanished into the night. Frustrated and angry, he returned to his sister's room. There he discovered that Dia had regained consciousness, while Tarka applied a damp towel to her throat wound. "We'll keep watch the rest of the night," said Tarka. "In the morning, we'll take the first train back to Ado Ikiti." "Rano," Dia shouted, "did you find out who or what attacked me?" "No," Rano confessed. "It escaped into the mosque yard. But whatever it was, Tarka is right. We must leave here as quickly as possible." But Dia began shaking her head. "I won't let this drive us from our house in which we've been so happy." Rano and Tarka tried to persuade her to leave, but still she refused. "We've leased this house for 5 years," she said, "and we've been here less than 1. We can't afford to move elsewhere while paying rent on this place." Her brothers reluctantly agreed, and next morning the local constable helped them decide when he suggested it must have been a lunatic escaped from some asylum. Then he added with great authority, "He's not likely to return." So they stayed at Kari Hall, but Rano and Dia switched rooms. Dia kept her shutters closed fast at night. Both Rano and Tarka kept loaded pistols nearby. Winter came and went without incident. One night, sometime around the middle of March, Dia was suddenly awakened by a dreadful scratching at her shutters. When she looked up, she saw the same gruesome, pale, shriveled face staring back at her. She screamed as loud as she could, and her brothers dashed out of the house with their pistols drawn. Tarka spotted the creature loping across the lawn and fired. The lead ball lodged firmly into the thing's left leg, and the force of the impact sent the monster sprawling, but it quickly recovered and scrambled over the graveyard wall. But this time, Rano and Tarka reached the wall in time to see the dark figure disappear into a neglected vault. The next day, in the company of the constable and several other local authorities, the vault was opened. Inside, they discovered that all of the coffins had been smashed and their contents strewn across the floor. Only one coffin lay intact, though its lid was loose. At the constable's instruction, Rano and Tarka raised the coffin lid. Dia gasped, for lying inside was the pale and withered figure that had twice appeared and attacked her at the hall. Then further investigation revealed that the left leg of the body had been damaged by a pistol shot. Now it is a fact that no one uttered the dreaded word vampire, though all knew full well that such was among them, and by common agreement they did the only thing that could permanently banish the evil that haunted them. They burned the body to ashes. After that, there were no more disturbances at Kari Hall. And that concludes another excursion into the darkness on the Nightfall radio show. Thank you for listening to the program. The Nightfall radio show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. If you enjoy the show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to submit a short story, poem, or artwork, Email your submission along with a brief bio to nightfallradioshow@mail.com. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. I'll see you again at Nightfall. You're listening to the Blackwater Media YouTube channel.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at
Welcome to the Historian's Almanac. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. On this episode of the show, the gunfight at the OK Corral. On October 26, 1881, four men met at the corner of 5th and Allen Streets in the bustling silver mining town of Tombstone, Arizona. They walked north on 5th, turned left on Fremont Street, and headed toward a vacant lot next to the OK Corral. Minutes later, 3 men would be dead, and the 4 men who had walked to the corral and killed them, Tombstone Marshal Virgil Earp, his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and Wyatt's friend Doc Holliday, had unknowingly secured their places in history. The gunfight at the OK Corral is arguably the single most famous incident in the Old West. But what was it about? And why has it, above all the many other gunfights that took place in the era of frontier justice, achieved such infamy? To understand the gunfight, you have to first understand the town. Tombstone in 1881 was a thriving, bustling silver mining community. There's a huge misconception about Tombstone in the 1880s, that it was a violent, dangerous place, says local author and historian Don Taylor. It was extremely sophisticated and massively wealthy. $37 million in 1880s dollars of silver was mined there. That's $8.25 billion today. They had everything. They had fresh seafood every day. They would catch it in Baja, California, pack it in barrels of salt, ice, and seaweed at dusk, freight it by train to Benson or Contention City, immediately pack it onto wagons, and bring it into Tombstone by dawn every day. It was a very opulent town. But again, people don't understand, especially when they visit there today. The city in those days was open 24 hours. The miners worked rotating 10-hour shifts. Everything had to be open when they got off, including banks. They were also pumping 2.5 million gallons of water out of the mines every day to keep them dry. So you had all the mining activity, all the milling activity, all the water rushing down Tough Nut Street, and the town open 24 hours a day. It must have been noisy as hell. As the mines thrived, so did all manner of supporting businesses, banks, bars, restaurants, hotels, and prostitutes, many of whom worked out of small cribs that lined 6th Street. The riches to be had attracted plenty of would-be entrepreneurs. Among them, Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, James, and Warren Earp, and also Doc Holliday. Both Virgil and Wyatt had been lawmen. Virgil had recently been appointed to deputy marshal for the part of the Arizona Territory that included Tombstone. And although some record keeping at the time was poor, it is possible that Wyatt may have been a deputy marshal as well. Certainly it appears as if all the brothers were anxious to join the list of those profiting from Tombstone's booming business. They invested in one of the mines. James tended bar. Wyatt rode as a stagecoach guard and dealt faro, the popular card game of the time, in a local saloon. But Tombstone's growth and growing sophistication grated with one segment of society, the cowboys, a loose confederation of ranchers and cattle rustlers. The cowboys, who were predominantly rural Southern Confederates, eyed the primarily Yankee mercantile class that was dominating Tombstone, and which the Earps typified with suspicion. And the feeling was mutual. It didn't take long after the Earps' arrival in late 1879 for tensions between them and the cowboys to develop, particularly with Virgil and Wyatt spending time in law enforcement positions. That tension reached boiling point when Wyatt helped in the identification and arrest of some cowboy members in a pair of stagecoach robberies, and the cowboys in turn asserted that Wyatt and Holliday had in fact been the ones responsible for the holdups. On the night of October 25th, 1881, one of the cowboy leaders, Ike Clanton, got into a heated drunken argument with Holliday, and the next morning he wandered drunkenly up and down Allen Street, threatening to kill him and the Earps. A series of confrontations steadily escalated until Virgil was informed that the group of armed cowboys had gathered outside Fly's boarding house, where Holliday was living, in a vacant lot close to the OK Corral. Carrying guns inside city limits was a violation of a town ordinance, and it provided Virgil, who was now town marshal, with an opportunity to arrest the cowboys. But there may have also been other considerations at play. As the self-identified Dr. J, who leads up historical tours of Tombstone today, explains, Ike Clanton had openly threatened to kill the Earps. And why are they in that alley? Because it's right outside Fly's boarding house. So if you're Doc Holliday, you show up and here's a bunch of guys with guns outside your house. You might want to think about, are they going to get me tomorrow if I don't get them today? Virgil deputized his brothers and Holliday, and they set off for the vacant lot. "Throw up your hands," shouted Virgil as they reached the alleyway's entrance. "I mean to disarm you." There was a pause, and the click-click of a gun or guns being cocked. "Hold on, I don't want that," shouted Virgil, but it was too late. There were 2 shots fired simultaneously. It is uncertain by whom. And then, as Wyatt later testified, the fight then became general. Ironically, Ike Clanton, who had instigated the confrontation, fled the scene, grabbing Wyatt and screaming that he was unarmed. "The fight has commenced," snarled Earp. "Get to fighting or get away." Clanton promptly took off, as did another cowboy, Billy Claiborne. Within seconds, 2 of the cowboys, Tom McClowry and Billy Clanton lay mortally wounded. Virgil Earp had been shot in the calf, and Morgan Earp shot through the shoulder blades. A third cowboy, Frank McClowry, shot in the stomach, staggered into Fremont Street, and leveled his gun at Holliday. "I've got you now," he said, mistakenly believing Holliday was out of ammo. "Blaze away," taunted Holliday. "You're a daisy if you do." At that point, both Holliday and Morgan Earp fired almost simultaneously. Bullets from one or both of their guns struck McClowry in the head, killing him. The entire gunfight lasted approximately 30 seconds. The following day, the headline in the Tombstone Epitaph newspaper read, "3 men hurled into eternity in the duration of a moment." The cowboy supporters insisted that their men had been killed in cold blood. The Earps and Holliday stood trial for murder, but were cleared. 130 years later, the gunfight has been the focus of numerous motion pictures and part of many more, and was even pivotal to an episode in the original series, Star Trek. So we ask again, why has the slaying of 3 men on a misdemeanor firearms violation endured through history? In January 1881, Tombstone Mayor John Clum joined the brand new Associated Press. He explains, "So everything he wrote went to San Francisco, Chicago, New York. Everybody knew what was going on here." There was also, explains Tim Fattig, who works as a tourist guide at the OK Corral and has written a voluminous biography of Wyatt Earp, another factor. The fact that the gunfight did not mark the end of the Earp-Cowboy feud. On December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp survived an assassination attempt but lost the use of his left arm. The following March, Morgan was gunned down and killed while playing billiards. In revenge, Wyatt, Warren Earp, Holliday, and others set out on a vendetta ride for justice in which they killed at least 3 cowboys, including the faction's de facto leader, Curly Bill Brocious. It was the vendetta ride that truly elevated the gunfight in public perception, Fattig says. The idea of a brother gaining revenge for one brother's murder and another being wounded is compelling. That's one reason why Wyatt Earp dominates the history books and the mythology at his brother's expense. He was the one who led the ride for vengeance. There is also another reason. In 1931, 2 years after Earp's death, author Stuart Lake published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, an account he produced with Earp's collaboration. After that came the movies, My Darling Clementine, Gunfight at the OK Corral, and more, and the TV series, including The Life and Times of Wyatt Earp. Wyatt is lionized above the others, in other words, because he outlived them all and got to tell his story. The rest, as they say, is history. That concludes another episode of the Historian's Almanac. Thank you for listening to the program. I'd like to invite you to listen to my other program, Agenda Earth, along with co-host Mark Zaski. The show can be heard on the Crypto Reality YouTube channel and also on the Agenda Earth Facebook page. I'm Dr. William Lester, and remember, history comes alive on the Historian's Almanac.
J-E-L-L. Oh, the big red letters stand for the Jello family. Oh, the big red letters stand for the Jello family. That's Jello.
Yum, yum, yum.
Jello pudding.
Yum, yum, yum.
Jello tapioca pudding. Yes, sirree.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now,
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome to the Historian's Almanac. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. On today's show, the history of Motown, the sound of young America. Above the front windows of Motown Records, Detroit headquarters, was a sign that read, Hitsville, USA. Placed there by Motown founder Berry Gordy soon after his company moved into the modest home at 2648 West Grand Boulevard, the sign demonstrated Gordy's blazing and at the time unearned arrogance. Then, the slogan came true. Founded on January 12, 1959, Motown quickly became another Detroit factory where the Big Three produced automobiles. Motown assembled the soul and pop classics that changed America. There's no hyperbole in that statement. Arriving at the height of the civil rights movement, Motown was a black-owned, black-centered business that gave white America something they could just not get enough of. Joyous, sad, romantic, mad, grooving, moving music. A former boxer and automobile worker, Berry Gordy was a nascent songwriter when, at the urging of Smokey Robinson, a songwriter 10 years younger than Gordy, he decided to establish Motown Records. The two had become friends years earlier, and Robinson, who was the lead singer of a band called The Miracles, produced, wrote, and sang several of Motown's most memorable hits, including the label's first smash song, Shop Around, in 1960. A year later, Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes was the label's first #1 song. It would not be the last. Over the next decade, the sheer number of chart-topping artists, musicians, and groups produced by Motown defied comprehension. Martha and the Vandellas, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Temptations, Junior Walker and the All-Stars, the Four Tops, Diana Ross and the Supremes, the Commodores, Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, all became part of what would become known as the Motown sound. It is rumored that Gordy modeled his hit factory after the Detroit car assembly line that he knew so well. Make a good product, then make something similar, and make it quick. Over here were the songwriters, Robinson and the team of Eddie Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Brian Holland. Over there was the talent, Stevie Wonder, whom the label discovered when he was 11. Marvin Gaye, who wanted so much to be a jazz crooner before he came into his own in the late 60s. And above all, Diana Ross, whom the label put its stake in early on, and who was told so many times that she was a star that she drove off one of the Supremes before quitting to launch a solo career. In a neglected corner were the session musicians, the Funk Brothers, who played on God knows how many hit songs. Let's just say it was a lot. So what was the Motown sound? Great melodies, lots of tambourines and hand clapping, blaring horns, interplay between the lead singer and his or her backup vocalists, driving bass lines and foot-slapping drum parts. In his essential Motown history, Where Did Our Love Go?, Nelson George writes, Motown chief engineer Mike McLean built a minuscule, tinny-sounding radio designed to approximate the sound of a car radio. This high-end bias of Motown's recordings can be partially traced to the company's reliance on this piece of equipment. They knew people would be listening on their car stereos and on their transistor sets, and they were going to do what it took to make their songs sound good and memorable. Even if you couldn't put your finger on it, when a Motown song came on, you knew it. Throughout the 60s, Motown produced a catalog of songs that cannot be rivaled. You've Really Got a Hold on Me, Heatwave, Dancing in the Street, Tracks of My Tears, Where Did Our Love Go?, My Guy, Baby Love, My Girl, Reach Out, I'll Be There, I Can't Help Myself, Get Ready, Stop in the Name of Love, The Way You Do the Things You Do, and so on. They were simple love songs that told simple stories, often in joyously happy or heartbreakingly sad ways. And all the while, Motown was the pride of Detroit and the pride of Black America, though Gordy tried, with his usual bluster, to make it the sound of Young America, a label he began to stamp on all of the company's vinyl. Around the time of the 1967 Detroit riots, however, things changed, as they eventually had to. Gordy looked west towards Los Angeles. How could such a large entertainment company as his not be involved in movies and television? Dissatisfied with the increasing disconnect between the success of their work and the level of their pay, the songwriting team of Holland, Dozier, Holland broke off from Motown. And while the Jackson 5 was on the rise, most of the rock-steady Motown acts of the early 60s were on the wane. In 1971, though, the label released what is arguably its grandest artistic statement. Something not at all of a piece with its previous poppy output. Marvin Gaye put out What's Going On, a thoughtful, socially conscious album whose title track Gordy famously called the worst song he had ever heard. A year later, Motown deserted Detroit for LA, and Stevie Wonder turned 21, thereby taking creative control of his music. Within 4 years, he had released Talking Book, Inner Visions, and Songs in the Key of Life. It was arguably the last great burst of Motown creativity. Gordy, distracted by Hollywood, released 2 films starring Diana Ross, Mahogany and the Billie Holiday biopic, Lady Sings the Blues. The 1980s brought Rick James and Lionel Richie, and The Big Chill, a white yuppie film with an amazing Motown soundtrack. Ain't Too Proud to Beg was reduced to dishwashing music. By 1988, Gordy had had enough. He sold the company to MCA, which in turn sold it to Polygram, which in turn was bought by Universal. Really though, who cares who owns it now? Just pop on one of those numerous greatest hits albums in your collection. Or okay, fine, even the Big Chill soundtrack. And recall the glory of Motown, the sound of Young America. The music doesn't sound 50 years old at all. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Historian's Almanac. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester, and I'd like to remind you that you can hear these episodes on the Historian's Almanac Facebook page, on Google+, and also on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. And remember, history comes alive on the Historian's Almanac.
You know, I always did think that Lifebuoy Health Soap got me extra clean.
But I never knew how right I was till the doctors came along and actually proved it. Yes, it's true. After comparing the effects of daily baths with different soaps, these doctors made this amazing statement. Actually, you're cleaner, safer from BO when you bathe daily with Lifebuoy than when you bathe with any other leading soap. Something to think about, isn't it? Well, the answer's simple. Lifebuoy does more than just remove the grime and perspiration you can see. Lifebuoy is more effective than any other leading soap against invisible dirt that can form a foothold for BO. Lifebuoy gets you even cleaner than the eye can see. After 820 scientific tests, these doctors say that Lifebuoy's purifying ingredient makes the difference. And this same purifying ingredient actually makes Lifebuoy milder, safe even for a baby's tender skin. So enjoy a refreshing Lifebuoy bath every day. You'll like Lifebuoy's creamy rich lather, its wonderful mildness. Get Lifebuoy tomorrow.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile found...
This edition of the show, we will be discussing one of the most important, in my mind, archaeological artifacts in all of history, the Shroud of Turin. And my guest is a gentleman that I've had on the air a number of times. He is quite an authority on the subject, and we'll go into the hows and the whys. He's also a guy I consider to be a really good friend. So let's not waste any time and bring on the air Mr. Barry Schwartz. Welcome to Shadowland Radio Show.
Thank you, William. I appreciate being on your show again.
Absolutely. We've done a couple of these shows. It's always fun. It's an interesting topic. It's an important topic because it's got to do with some subject matter that is really one of the pivot points in the history of mankind. So let's get right into it. Give the listeners a thumbnail 101. What do we mean when we say the Shroud of Turin?
Good. Okay, the Shroud of Turin is a 14.5-foot long, 3.5-foot wide sheet of ancient linen that bears the image of a scourged, crucified, speared man, most likely the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth.
Now, that's one of those statements where you do have to have a pause.
And I did pause.
Right. Because, I mean, it's incredible because, of course, Jesus of Nazareth is one of those, obviously a pivotal figure in history. And to have something that could possibly be archaeological evidence of his crucifixion in many ways as chronicled in the gospel text is amazing. And it speaks, I think, to the veracity of at least that aspect of the gospel narrative. So let's get right down into it. Many people, Christians, non-Christians, atheists, Jews, Muslims, whoever, most people are aware with the skeleton of this story, right?
Sure.
So I want to get down to the injuries, the anatomy and physiology. What, in your view, about these injuries correspond to the gospel narrative that speak to you in terms of this being a real piece of history?
Well, I could answer it simply by saying everything about the shroud.
Okay.
But that's not good for radio. That's not good enough. So let's get specific.
Okay.
Every wound on the Shroud of Turin is not only forensically accurate, and that's based on the examination and the study of the shroud by multiple medical forensic experts over the last 40 or 50 years. Everything is accurate, but even more so, everything described in the Gospels that was done to Jesus during his 2 days of torture before he was crucified is documented with forensic accuracy on the shroud, more so than any artistic depiction ever. And one of the best examples is this. There are scourge wounds on the man's body, on the back of his body, which is typical of the way artists have rendered the scourging of Jesus throughout, art history. What's interesting is no artist has ever shown any scourge wounds on the front of Jesus' body, and yet the man of the shroud has scourge wounds that are not only on the entire back of his body, but also around to the front. And here's why. If you're standing behind somebody with a 3-thonged leather whip and you're scourging them, if you take even a baby step closer to that person and you swing that whip, those thongs are going to come around. They're going to hit the front of the body as well. Now, no artist has ever shown that. They showed Jesus' back, torn up by the scourging, but no one has ever depicted it as accurately as what's on the shroud. This is much more accurate than any artist's depiction. So that's one of the things. There is a spear wound in the side with a large blood flow, probably the darkest and largest blood flow on the shroud, emanating from the spear wound in the side. There are blood stains on the head from a cap or crown of thorns. And I say cap because the entire scalp is covered with wounds from these thorns, not just in a circlet around the head. That's, typically the way artists have depicted it. They took the old ancient method of depicting Roman emperors with a laurel wreath, and they just exchanged the laurel wreath for thorns in their motif when they were depicting the crucifixion and scourging of Jesus. And yet what we have on the shroud shows that his entire scalp is covered with these wounds. We also have crucifixion wounds in the hands and in the feet. So everything that they said they did to him in the Gospels is depicted with forensic accuracy on the shroud, including his face, which was obviously severely beaten. Both of his cheekbones are swollen, although one is far more swollen than the other, almost like a prize fighter who just lost a fight. So from a forensics point of view, we have this great accuracy. And one little point I'd like to bring out, I usually do this in my lectures when I show these blood stains. When he was laid down, the blood from the side wound, because of gravity, went down and pooled at the small of his back. So for the listeners who may not realize this, I'm not a Christian. I'm a Jew, just like Jesus and most of his disciples were. And so I never entered into this with any religious kind of undertones. For me, when they asked me to be on this team to examine the shroud, I said no. I didn't feel that it was appropriate for me to go there and get involved in something that was outside of my own expertise and knowledge and even my own belief system. I was raised in an Orthodox home, much like a Fiddler on the Roof, if you will. My parents were both immigrants from Poland. My grandparents lived with us. The aunts and the uncles came over all the time on the weekends, on Fridays, and we practiced Orthodox Judaism in our home. We had 2 sets of dishes and 2 sets of silverwares and kept kosher and lit the candles and did the morning prayers. So I was raised in an Orthodox home. So when I got invited to be a member of this team, I said no. I didn't really feel comfortable with it. But they explained to me the properties of the shroud's image that had just then been sort of visualized for the first time using a scientific instrument. And those properties hooked me, because the shroud has a property unlike any other image I've ever seen, and I've seen quite a few in a nearly 50-year career behind the camera as a professional photographer. So to me, that image property caught my curiosity, even though I had no emotional attachment to the subject matter. And if anything, I think I said something to the effect of, give us 5 minutes and we'll find the paint and the brush strokes and we'll come home. Well, that was 39 years ago. and there was no paint and there are no brush strokes. Our team did every type of non-destructive testing on that piece of cloth that we could do. Everything from chemistry to physics to various types of photographic experiments, X-ray reflectance and fluorescence, ultraviolet fluorescence photography. So we did all of these techniques that are typically used both by archaeologists and forensics experts to examine and characterize both the chemistry and the physics of the cloth and the image. And in that respect, we proved, and you won't find me using the word proved that often, because in science it takes a lot to prove something, but we proved that the image on the shroud is not an artwork. We've proved that, and that information isn't just written up in some book or some magazine or some website. It was published in peer-reviewed scientific journals of the highest caliber in that era of the late 1970s, early 1980s. So the evidence is there, and although I was not convinced of the shroud's authenticity immediately, matter of fact, it took from the time we started the examination till I became convinced that the shroud was authentic based on the science, 20 years. So I didn't rush. And within that period of time, all the evidence, of course, I was privileged because I had access to all the scientific data as a member of the team. And ultimately, I was convinced by the science, not by any religious motives or spiritual motives. Not that there's any problem with that, right. But I was convinced basically because the science told me this isn't an artwork. This is an image that formed by some mechanism. Believe it or not, we live in the most image-oriented era of human history. Everybody's got a camera and a computer attached to it in their pockets now, and yet there's never been an image with these physical properties. And to this day, modern science cannot determine a mechanism that can create an image with those chemical and physical properties.
Well, I think there's a lot here that needs to be piggybacked on, because you spoke about the fact that you had an Orthodox Jewish background.
Correct.
And that, once you got into the research, because initially you kind of balked at it.
I did.
Once you got into the research, the fact that your background was as an Orthodox Jew became immaterial.
Yeah, because, look, one of the important things people need to know about that team is that religion was never brought up. It was never an issue. People have criticized me because on our website I have a list of the team members, and I didn't list their religious affiliations. I've been criticized for that. Well, I would have to first know their religious affiliations. And since that was never an issue for our team, it never came up. And I know that there were 3 Jewish men on the team. My dear friend Vern Miller, may he rest in peace. I know he was Mormon. My friend Ken Stevenson is an evangelical Christian. There were some Protestants, some Catholics, some atheists, and some agnostics.
But isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that there were people who were criticizing you because you did not list the team members' religious affiliation, as if that had something to do with the research?
Well, I think that's sort of the misunderstanding that people had about our team, that somehow they thought our goal was to prove that was Jesus or prove the resurrection. And all we were trying to do is figure out what constitutes the image on this piece of cloth with 3-dimensional characteristics embedded into the density of the image. I don't want to get too technical here, but there is a correlation between the lights and darks of the shroud image and the distance between the cloth and the body when the image formed. How do you do that? We don't know. We can't do that today. We cannot create an image with these very same properties unless you go into a computer and create something, from scratch, 3D images. But that doesn't put an image onto a sheet of cloth with the spatial or depth information encoded into the density. That we don't know how to do that.
So let me. I'm sorry. There's a couple of things I want to. Okay, first of all, let's get this out of the way. Right now, based on, like you said, your 39 plus years of looking at this issue, the Shroud of Turin is not a medieval forgery.
Correct.
Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do, number one, I want you to tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you, and as the other members of that team, how you are uniquely qualified to have engaged in this research, because I think that is a relevant issue. I want the listeners to understand that Barry Schwartz is not a person who is just kind of floating out there and interested in the Shroud of Turin and is somehow some advocate for its veracity. I want, Barry, you to tell the listeners how and why you are qualified to be talking about this in this way.
Sure. Well, essentially, I'm a professional photographer, graduate of Brooks Institute of Photography, and some years after graduation, I actually was on the faculty there for 10 years. And I brought the Shroud Project to Brooks. When I was first invited, and now I have to go kind of back up a little and give you a little history. Yep. I operated a commercial photography studio in Santa Barbara, California, and my clients were aerospace companies, medical companies, and, some commercial work for advertising agencies and corporate entities. But my real background was very strongly in the technical areas, and so I was contracted by a company in Santa Barbara to be a consultant, a photographic consultant, on a project that company was doing for Los Alamos National Laboratories. Well, obviously, it was classified, and obviously, because it was Los Alamos, it had something to do with atomic bombs. And I'd love to tell you more, but it's classified. If I tell you more, I have to kill you, and there's too many of them. So we'll just leave it at that. Yeah. And so I spent 7 months as a consultant on this project for Los Alamos about atomic bombs. And at the end of that project, I'd worked with a gentleman named Don DeVan. May he rest in peace. He's gone too now. And shortly after we finished that project, the phone rang, and it was Don DeVan again. So I thought, aha, another project. When you're self-employed, when the phone rings, you're hoping it's the next project.
Absolutely.
Well, Don called me, and he said, okay, Barry, and I thought maybe it was going to be a job, and he said, no. He says, but what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I kind of thought about it for a moment. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don kind of laughed, and he said, so am I, remember? He was one of the other Jewish guys on our team in the end. So when he brought this up, I said, well, why, what about the Shroud of Turin? And he said, well, look, a couple of scientists over at Sandia Labs, a sister lab to Los Alamos, put a photograph of the Shroud of Turin into a device they had called a VP8 image analyzer, which just takes a black and white of an image and stretches it into vertical space on a screen into 3D space proportionate to the lights and darks of the image. You put a normal photograph in it, you get nonsense. You get all kind of distorted, jumbled results. You put an image of the Shroud of Turin into this, you get the natural relief of a human form. Well, when he explained that to me in more technical terms than I just used, I realized that there was something unique about this image, because that property doesn't exist in normal photography or art. You can't do that with photography or art. So at that moment in time, that property of the image interested me enough. Now, my background was working for aerospace. I worked for Hughes and Raytheon and Delco and a lot of scientific work and medical work. And then I worked for a lot of major medical device companies and eventually became a consultant at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center for 15 years at their laser research laboratory. So my technical background as a graduate of Brooks Institute, my experience in working with the aerospace and medical fields, that's really what qualified me to do the Los Alamos project that ultimately led me to my involvement with the Shroud. I continued that work, of course, even after we finished, until just about 7 or 8 years ago when I finally did retire from that kind of work. So my background, having a good technical knowledge and a good knowledge of using the technology to solve problems visually, brought me on board the Shroud team.
Okay, and wow. Okay, so if there shouldn't be anybody listening who doesn't understand that when it comes to this issue, you need to listen to Barry Schwartz. Barry.
Well, let me just interrupt to say that the other thing is this. There aren't very many of us left alive from 1978 examination of the Shroud. More than half the team have passed away now. So there are very few of us who can get up on radio or television and say, you know, I spent 5 days and nights in the room with the Shroud of Turin. Well, I left my DNA on it as well.
I can't remember the name of the book. I was working as a teenager in a public library, and this would have been in the early to mid 80s, and I saw a book about the Shroud on the shelves, and I pulled the book down and started flipping through it, and if I can remember correctly, this was a book that was kind of chronicling the work of your team.
Ah, that was John Heller's book.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the name of it, and it's escaping me at the moment. But John Heller was a member of our team. He was not there in Turin to collect the data. He was a member of our team who remained in America because, you know, it's expensive to fly guys over and put them in hotels and move all their equipment around. So only those members necessary to collect the data over those 5 days and nights were actually in Turin. John Heller was back here in the United States along with Dr. Alan Adler, the third Jewish member of our team, who was the blood chemistry expert on our team who proved the Shroud blood was actually blood and not paint or pigment. And so basically Heller's book chronicled our team and our involvement with the Shroud. But because John was not in Turin, he had to get that information secondhand from those of us who were there, and he spent a week in my office, in my studio in Santa Barbara at the time, interviewing me and collecting notes on what we did, and he did that with most of the other team members before he wrote that book. So it is about as close as you can get to a direct documentation of what we did in 1978.
Okay, all right. So so that was my first exposure to this issue, and I was mesmerized by it. I was probably 14 or 15 years old. To reproduce the Shroud of Turin, given all of our technology right now in 2017, could you reproduce what's on the Shroud?
You know, it's a great question. Not the first time I've been asked that question, and I'm going to give you the answer I gave the last person who asked me that question. If you were to put $1 million cash on my desk right now, I would push it back to you. If you told me that you can have this $1 million, all you've got to do is recreate an image with the same properties of the Shroud, I would just push the $1 million back in your lap, because there's no way that I know of, or that any of the imaging scientists who are on our team know of, to create an image on a sheet of linen with the same chemical and physical properties. No one has ever accomplished that, and there have been many efforts by skeptics to create something that looks like the Shroud. And, you know, look, my photographs are on the internet. You can use them as a reference. Any artist or photographer can use that as a basis to try and create their own, and yet nobody's even come close. And I have looked at every effort to do so in about the last 40 years. No one has ever come close.
Well, I saw some documentary on television at some point, and they were trying. I mean, it was laughable.
Yeah, I've participated in a few of those myself. That's why I'll be honest with you. I tell people not to get their Shroud information from television documentaries, even though I've appeared in more than 20 of them. Only 1 or 2 are worthy of even recommending to this day. The rest of them, not happy at all. Even though I participate, people have to remember that when you participate in one of these programs, they sit you in front of a camera, they ask you a bunch of questions, and then they edit that into an existing script that they have that they never make you aware of or allow you to see. And so basically all you can do is answer the questions as accurately and succinctly and honestly as possible, and pray that their editor doesn't take your words and twist them around into something different. I would say that happens about 50% of the time. So I've learned that the TV documentaries that we've been involved with over the years, they're entertainment first. They're not too scientific. I've had more than one director say, well, don't get too technical. And then he asks me a very technical question that can only be answered with a technical answer. And yet they tell me not to get too technical. So the problem with documentaries is they must be entertaining, or the networks won't buy them and put them on the air. And consequently, a lot of the networks feel that if they say one thing about the Shroud, they have to have somebody that says the opposing point of view to keep it, quote, fair and balanced. And because of that, you get all the nonsense mixed in with all the science that's documented, and it confuses the viewer to a point where they're not quite sure what to take or make about the Shroud. And I understand that.
This is, I don't, because, well, here's what I mean. And I think this is where we get into trouble a little bit. Okay, you know, if I say to you that, well, Barry, the sky is blue, but I have to have an opposing viewpoint for someone to tell me that the sky is, you know, green. But that's ridiculous. And,
well,
you know what I'm saying?
not going to argue. I wouldn't argue with you on that point, but that's what happens.
Yeah. And I think we get into trouble where we kind of create this scenario of false neutrality, and we have this kind of thing where, hey, one idea is just as good as another one, and of course that's never been true. Now you said. Oh, go ahead.
It's especially not true when there's plenty of science published in peer-reviewed journals. I mean, credible peer-reviewed journals, not just the ones that are on the internet today, but the print journals of that era, which, you know, if any of our work had leaked into the press before they published our papers, they wouldn't have published our papers. Nowadays, people will issue a press release before they submit their work to a journal. So the standards have dropped a good bit since those days, and the work that our team did appearing in the journals, some of the most foremost journals of the day, still carries far more weight than what we're seeing kind of popping up on the internet these days. So as far as these documentaries go, look, the way I see it is this. It's nice to put the information in front of the public. The sadness is it adds as much to the confusion as it does to the knowledge because of this need to sort of mix a yes always has to have a no after it.
Yeah.
So, and that's the point you're making there, that there's this kind of tendency to want to be equally fair on both sides of an issue. Well, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But when entertainment becomes the issue and the science is rather complicated on the Shroud, well, they don't really want to hear that. Can't you just sum it up in like 5 words? Well, not really. And that's the problem with these. So I have written editorials on our website where I've told people, look, don't use these shows as a basis for your knowledge on the Shroud. The problem with them is first of all, it's only 43 minutes. Now, my minimum time for a lecture is at least an hour when I'm giving lectures in person, and my normal lecture time is an hour and a half to 2 hours. So in 43 minutes, interrupted by commercials every 7 or 8 minutes, how can you tell the story of something this complex in such a short period of time? It's not an easy task. Having been a video producer in Los Angeles myself, I understand the limitations and difficulties, but at the same time, giving it a fair treatment is not so easy, and most of the big commercial networks, Nat Geo and Discovery and History and Learning Channel, I've appeared on all of them, Smithsonian Channel as well, and PBS and BBC, all of these, they've all made the effort, some more so than others, to do, and there are a few documentaries out there that I would recommend, but only a few. So I think that the most important thing for people to know is that when I got to a point where I came to accept the Shroud was authentic in about mid-1990s, I was looking at the press reports on our team, the work we'd done. I've been watching that over all those years, 17, 18 years. I was so offended that my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting the truth about the Shroud. There was no access to the science. There was nothing but speculation or people who had their own sort of agendas. So there was all this agenda-driven stuff, but no place where you could go and get the facts. Who reads scientific journals outside of the scientific community? Nobody. So I decided in 1995 that I would build a website. And I've got to share the incident that occurred. A friend of mine called me and he said, you know that Shroud thing you're involved with? And I said, yeah. He said, well, it turns out that's just a painting by Leonardo, or a photo by Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that. And so I thought he was joking, and I kind of laughed. And he said, no, I'm serious. And I said, really? Where did you get that information? And he said, well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. Uh-oh. And he saw it, obviously, on one of the tabloids. And at that moment, I had this epiphany. And I had a manila folder sitting on my desk, and I wrote on it 4 words, consider building a website. Now, frankly, William, I believe that's when God reached down and said, okay, now here's the real job. Because remember, I had resisted this for 20 years. And the real job was for me to take all the data and information that I had collected along with all the photographs I made, several thousands of photographs I made, and make them available to the public on the internet. So I built Shroud.com. We just celebrated our 21st anniversary online on January 21st. And that has become the de facto central clearinghouse of Shroud information on the planet, and certainly on the internet. We're number 1 on every search engine, and not because we paid money to be there, because we are number 1. And so the purpose of my being on that team, remember I said I was sort of struggling with that at the beginning, it became clear to me after about 20 years that my purpose on that team was far less about making photographs in 1978 and far more about educating the public and bringing this information to the public 20 years later. So I've now had 21 years of doing that, and of course Shroud.com has become very successful. We operate it under a nonprofit organization, STERA Inc., Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association. And so there's no question in anybody's mind that my goal here isn't about making money as much as it is about sharing this data. There's no advertising on that website. We pay for everything ourselves out of the nonprofit so that a viewer doesn't have to see a flashing ad for some inappropriate thing on a site that many people come to from a spiritual or religious point of view. Even though we are not a religious organization or affiliated, what we do is we provide access to all the information. And maybe the smartest thing I ever wrote is on the front page of the website, where it says, given the facts, we believe you have to make up your own mind about this. And by taking that position, I think that's been the success of the website. We're not pushing any theory. We're not promoting any particular points of view. We're saying, look, here's the data. You decide.
Yeah, and I think that I think that's the only way you can do it. I mean, look at the information. You mentioned earlier that on that original team that there was a I can't remember how you phrased it, but a blood specialist.
Dr. Alan Adler, yes.
Okay.
One of the other Jewish guys on the team. He was a world-renowned blood chemist.
Okay, blood chemist.
His idea of humor was wearing a blood-red T-shirt with the chemical formula for hemoglobin on it. And he thought that was hilarious. Of course, nobody else knew what it meant, because unless you're a blood chemist, you wouldn't recognize the chemical breakdown of hemoglobin. But that was his so he was kind of a beyond a blood expert. He was almost a fanatic in his expertise in that area. And he was the guy who took the blood samples that we had collected from the Shroud and analyzed them, and with the scientific data published the work showing that this is really blood. This is not an artist's depiction of blood. And then the forensic pathologists backed that up by saying, yeah, these are natural blood flows. This is not applied to the cloth, because the blood stains all soak through the cloth the way a blood stain would if it were in contact with a bleeding body. They are actually visible on both sides.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get out. So, I mean, because there's so much disinformation, misinformation. I wanted to get that out. So,
sure.
Not paint, not pigment, it's blood that we're looking at.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Now, another thing, looking at the face of the man on the Shroud, he has all the indications of a typical, what you would expect, first century Semitic type. Yes or no?
Yes. As a matter of fact, 2 researchers from Italy did what they call an anthropometric study of the Shroud. It's typically by measuring the length of the long bones, or the arms and legs of the man of the Shroud, the torso, and comparing that to the anthropological charts that they have that show the bone lengths of different races and places from different parts of the world. And this anthropometric study was done, and it's published in a journal, and it's available on shroud.com. And what they determined at the end of their study was this was a Semitic male. So even from an anthropological point of view, the data confirms that this is somebody from that part of the world, the Mideast, without doubt.
So ethnically, if we are going to apply the gospel chronicle, the gospel narrative to this artifact, then the man on the shroud ethnically is what we expect to see.
Yeah, it is. And you know, this is something that when you're doing these measurements and comparing them to the anthropological charts that they've, you know, that all the anthropologists use, I mean, that's science. That's being done with as much rigor as is possible, remembering that we're dealing with a piece of cloth. This is not the body. This is not the tomb we're looking at. This is an image formed on the cloth that wrapped that man's body. So there's so much we can learn from it, but there are also limitations to what we can learn from it. And I'll tell you something else, and this is a little same topic, but a little off topic at the same time. Unlike most archaeological objects on the planet, this one comes with its own special set of added complexity because it brings with it an emotional factor that is not typical of any other archaeological objects. Look, when King Tut toured the United States, we all went and saw it. Right. It was beautiful. We were impressed. We were moved. But none of us had the kind of an emotional response to it, except maybe a few Egyptians who might have been distant relatives of King Tut. The rest of us looked at it and went, yeah, that's great. You know, it's beautiful. And we moved on. The shroud, on the other hand, brings with it this complete kind of subtext of faith and religion, and the fundamental basis of Christianity is tied up in this too. So this is no longer just a scientific object. This carries with it this sort of overtoned emotional factor that just completely changes the way people regard this. Yeah. It's not just an object of science.
You're right. And the bottom line is, and you know, we love data. And we'd love to keep it straight down the line and you know, do the science. You spoke about the anthropological charts.
Correct.
But you know, between you and I, and we're old friends and colleagues.
Yep.
We're talking about Jesus.
Yeah, of course.
That changes the game.
People ask me all the time, well, do you think this is the real thing, and do you think that's really Jesus? And I say, absolutely. Who else could it be? There's nobody else in history who was scourged, speared, crucified, and crowned with a crown of thorns. Who else has ever had that happen to him? Now, any one of those things might have been done by Romans to other criminals in Congo, but all of them combined, only once do we know of in all of history that happened, and that was the man known as Jesus of Nazareth.
It's almost silly. It's almost silly to play this game about are we sure this is Jesus? You know what I mean?
Well, look, from a scientific point of view, we can never prove it's Jesus. People say, well, can't we do DNA? And I always say, well, look, do you happen to have a DNA profile of Jesus handy?
Yeah. Exactly.
Because unless you have that, we don't have anything to compare it to. Sure, we can look at haplotypes and see that it would probably the haplotypes would probably say he's Semitic. But there's another problem with the Shroud of Turin: contamination. You and I were talking before the show about our kind of spilling our DNA. Our epithelial cells, we're shedding them constantly. So just leaning over the shroud is enough to leave your DNA on it. The fact that I handled it for 5 days and nights along with, all the other scientists, and leaned over it and studied it, breathed on it. So we all left our DNA on it. So when you do a DNA analysis of the man of the shroud, how do you know that's the man of the shroud and not somebody else who's handled it over the centuries? Because all of us have left our DNA there. So DNA analysis, although people always bring it up, it's not a viable object for DNA analysis, other than perhaps to do a DNA analysis of the pollens that were found on the shroud to identify precisely what plant they may have come from. But to identify the person on the shroud from DNA, is virtually impossible. Now, a couple of people have suggested trying to get some blood from the backside, the side that was not facing the body where the blood soaked through, and perhaps trying to do a DNA analysis there where there would be likely to be much less contamination, because that's the side that's always been hidden away from people. There was a backing sheet sewn onto the back, so the backside of the cloth would be far less contaminated with other DNA than the front side. I mean, people have leaned over it and kissed it, popes and bishops and archbishops. So DNA analysis itself isn't going to provide us with a solution unless somebody can give us a profile of Jesus to compare with.
I think a lot of people, especially laymen, look to DNA because it's perceived to be as close to irrefutable, infallible as we can get.
Yeah, it is, and there's no doubt about that. So unless the technology improves, which of course it continues to do on a regular basis anyway, there may be a time in the future where there's some value to a DNA analysis of the shroud, but they're going to have to overcome the contamination issue, and then they're going to have to be certain that what they test is actually originally from the shroud and not added over the centuries by those who have handled it, breathed on it, repaired it, manipulated it, or even held it by the corners and from balconies to display it to the public.
Let me ask you a question about the linen itself. Is the cloth itself, is the fabric itself what we would expect to see from a first century burial in Palestine?
It is, with one qualification. This would have been an expensive piece of cloth by first century standards, and we know that this type of cloth was not woven in the Jerusalem area. My belief is that the nearest place, based on, the studies that have been done over the years, the nearest place that would manufacture a herringbone weave, a 3/2 herringbone weave as it's described, would be Syria. Now, Syria isn't that far from Jerusalem as the crow flies by today's standards.
Right.
But in the first century, most people didn't venture more than a few miles from where they were born in their entire lives. So something coming in from Syria would have come in on the back of a camel on a caravan, would have been imported, would have been more costly. And we know in the Gospels it says that the cloth was provided by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man. So obviously Joseph, who already had his tomb prepared, just like my father did when he passed, everything was taken care of. Joseph of Arimathea had done the same thing. He had a tomb, and he probably had this cloth. Now, in the Gospels, and some Gospels, it says he bought the cloth. Well, yeah, but it doesn't say he ran out Friday afternoon just before the Sabbath to buy it. He probably had it already, had already purchased it for his own use and made it available as he did with the tomb so that Jesus could be buried.
Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, he was Sanhedrin,
and
right.
So, he was in the money class.
Correct.
And so, yeah, it makes total sense.
Right, that's the point that I wanted to make, that there's a consistency there with the facts that we know about Joseph, which is very little, actually. But we did know he was Sanhedrin, he was wealthy and of the wealthy class, and he could have afforded a cloth like this without problem. So that's the only thing that makes it. It's not the typical cloth, but if you read in the Torah, in the Old Testament, it says that men of high stature should be buried in pure linen raiments. Okay, now that's important for a couple of different reasons. The primary one being that that's what we have here. This is a pure linen cloth woven of pure linen from the flax plant.
So this man appears to have been buried in traditional Jewish custom of that time.
Correct. Correct.
Yes.
And when my father died, he was buried in a shroud very much like this, in a plain wooden coffin. And those were his wishes, to have an Orthodox Jewish burial, and that's how it's done. And, even the Muslims to this day will wrap bodies in shrouds similar to this. And Jews still do it, and many Christians too. So it is not inconsistent with the, cultural ways that people have buried their dead for several millennia. So it is consistent, but with the stipulation that this would not have been typical of your average burial. Most people couldn't have afforded that. Your average person wouldn't have afforded that.
Now, you detailed the injuries earlier, but can we tell medically what this man died. What will we officially say this man's cause of death was? Because we can't say, well, he died of crucifixion. That.
No, that's correct.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, what did he die from?
There's some debate. Now, some people believe that he suffocated because being up on the cross the way he would have had to perhaps lift himself up to catch a breath based on the way he was suspended. However, so some forensic pathologists believe he died of asphyxiation.
Okay.
Other forensic pathologists, particularly Dr. Frederick Zugaby, may he rest in peace, he's a dear friend who's passed away also, Dr. Zugaby went several steps further. He suspended bodies on crosses, not by nailing them, but with leather straps to hold bodies up on the cross. And what he determined was that almost 60% of the body weight would have been supported by the feet. So rising up and breathing would have been less of a problem, but because of him being beaten the night before, given no water, then the next day being scourged, and then ultimately crowned with a crown of thorns and then crucified, that his body was in both traumatic and, I'm trying to remember the other kind, hypovolemic shock. And because of those kinds, that kills you. That'll kill you faster than anything else. That's why when an accident's victim on the side of the road is injured, they immediately cover the body and elevate the feet to keep them from going into shock. Mm-hmm. Shock will kill people faster than just about anything else. And Dr. Zugaby believed that he died of traumatic shock, hypovolemic shock. And that probably makes more sense to my mind than the asphyxiation. Now, again, I'm not a forensic pathologist, and there is not total agreement between the major forensic pathologists who've studied the shroud. So once again, we have both in agreement that he was dead, but not in agreement as to what was the specific cause of death.
Well, given the nature of the injuries, and, if the gospel narrative, which corresponds to the injuries,
right?
If it's anywhere close to the truth, then the idea of the shock, the anavolemic shock, is absolutely believable.
Sure. Well, look, here's the thing. Anybody who suffers those kinds of injuries is going to go into shock. That's just a standard medical fact. Yeah. So, and we know that shock will kill you faster than a lot of other things. So it makes sense that even though there's a debate still going on amongst the medical guys as to cause of death, from a kind of a logical point of view, the most obvious and the most acceptable reason is that he died from the different kinds of shock that he was suffering from, both traumatic and hypovolemic. Remember, they gave him no water, so basically he was massively dehydrated, and then with all the blood loss plus the perspiration of being scourged and beaten, and it's a warm place there, it's not like Michigan today where it's pretty cold up there today. So all of these things contributed, I think, to it. But I think that in the end, even though people argue and debate these issues, in the end, does it really matter? He died, and look how he died. He died being tortured horribly for something he believed in. And even as a Jew who is not a Christian, I still have great love and respect and admiration for this man who was willing to die a horrible death for what he believed in.
No, without a doubt.
And so one has to show great deference and respect and love, even if you're not a Christian. One has to, I guess the word is admire his courage and strength for what he did.
Well, that's right. And it doesn't require, and of course, and it gets really crazy and muddy, and you never want to get pulled down into these various theological tentacles, but it does not require adherence to strict Christian theology to recognize and appreciate, and to use your word, admire the tenets, philosophies of Jesus.
Yeah, I as a Jew, we have the 10 Commandments, we have the 792 rules in the Mishnah. Pretty complicated. One of the things that kept me from practicing Judaism was it was just way, 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 way too complex. Jesus took all of that and he simplified it down to 2 rules. love God and love one another. And if you don't break those two, you can't break any of the rest. I like that. Yeah. And I try and live my life by those two simple kind of rules. Love God and love one another.
He thumbnailed it.
Yeah. He did, but he did it in an extraordinary way. He took all of that complexity and narrowed it down to the essence, which is loving God and loving one another. I don't have any problem with that. I like that. And I think that connected me back to my faith, back 20-some years ago, because I'd walked away from all organized religion. Be honest, I'm still not a fan of organized religion, and my faith is in God directly. So, that's me. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's what works for me.
Sure.
Each of us has to find it in our own hearts. People often say, well, what's the meaning of the shroud to faith? And I always say, well, listen, if you need the shroud, then you better re-examine your faith. The idea of faith is you don't need these kinds of evidences. Mm-hmm. So I always say that if the shroud doesn't convince you, then you need to re-examine your faith, or if you need the shroud to convince you, rather. And so the way I see it, the answer to faith is not going to be on that piece of cloth, but in the eyes and hearts of those who look upon it. And I think that's where God lives.
And to me, it's very simple. If this shroud, if this image, the man on the shroud is indeed the historical Jesus of Nazareth,
mm-hmm.
It should say to you by default that this was an extraordinary man, and there was something at that time extraordinary going on.
Absolutely.
At a minimum, that's what it should tell you.
I think that's what it does. And let me share a quick little story with you about my little Jewish mother.
Okay.
When she was in her 80s, I'm from Pittsburgh, PA originally, and I was going back for a high school reunion, and my Catholic friends asked me if I'd be willing to do a lecture while I was there. And the Catholic Archdiocese arranged for a venue and for a place for me to do it and put it in the bulletins, and we had a big turnout, and it was great. And my mother was there, my cousins, and my brother. You know how a Jewish, any family, he's getting up, they want to see me speak. So the end of that, we're driving back to my mother's place. Now, she was an immigrant from Poland when she was 7 years old. She was the youngest of 4 kids. Not well educated, high school education only. Not a very sophisticated woman or, well read necessarily. And so she was silent as we were driving home. And when a Jewish mother is silent, be afraid.
Something's wrong.
Yeah. So I finally turned to her and I said, okay, Mother, what do you think? I didn't know what to expect. And she looked at me and she said, well, of course, it's authentic. Now, what's this little old Jewish lady telling me it's authentic? I said, really? Well, what do you base that on? What makes you say that? And then she kind of gave me that Jewish mother attitude, that condescending attitude of Barry.
Right.
They wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years. If it belonged to anybody else, it wouldn't have mattered.
Right.
So I kind of laughed. I thought, well, that's kind of humorous, until I thought about it a little longer and realized what a profound observation that was. Because here's the thing. Jewish law forbids images of God of any kind, as do the Muslims. And Jewish law requires that the blood of a victim be buried with the body. So removing that cloth from the tomb with both an image and blood on it would violate a couple of Jewish laws. That's why they had to keep it a secret or put themselves at risk of being killed themselves. So for them to rescue this piece of cloth, to hide it and preserve it, which they obviously did, put them at great risk. And so my mother's point was well taken. Why would they have done that unless it belonged to somebody so important that it was worth those risks?
Yeah, exactly. And
a little old Jewish lady sees through it. The biggest skeptics that I meet are Christians. It really blows me away. Mm-hmm. It's like, really? I, a Jewish guy, have to convince you that this is the cloth that wrapped Jesus? So I've made a point not to try and convince anybody. Matter of fact, a guy came up to me in Canada after one of my lectures and said, oh, that was a great lecture, Mr. Schwartz, but you'll never convince me. And I looked him right in the face and said, well, what makes you think that I even care what you believe? That's between you and God. Take it up with him. Because it's not my place to do theology. I'm an old hippie photographer. Come on. I'm not a rabbi, a minister, or a priest. And it's not my place to tell anybody what to believe or how to believe.
Well, okay.
All I can say...
Well, Barry, Barry, I got to stop you because, see, I mean, this makes my head catch on fire. You did a lecture. The guy's attending your lecture. You attend lectures to receive information.
Correct.
You give lectures to disseminate information.
Absolutely.
So, I listened to your lecture, and it was probably full of data, a lot of numbers, but you'll never convince me.
Yeah, I don't put too much of that hard data into my lectures because my lectures are more sharing my personal experience.
Okay.
If they want to see the technical details, they can go to shroud.com. All the stuff's there.
Okay.
So I try and avoid that because that's the quickest way to put audiences to sleep. My lectures are not really academic in nature. They're much more personal, sharing a personal story of. I always start my lectures the same way by saying, "What's a nice Jewish boy like me doing involved with the most important relic of Christianity?"
Yeah.
I'll give you the answer at the end of the lecture. And that's what I do. So, so I try not to get too technical. And on the other hand, I also teach a course on the Shroud in the master's program at the Pontifical Seminary in Rome. I'll be there in May to teach it again.
Wow.
And that's in the master's program. That's an academic course. That would put any standard audience to sleep in about 10 minutes.
Sure.
Because it's designed to be academic. It has footnotes and references and stuff that I don't put into my lectures to the general public because that would just put them right to sleep.
I'm just intrigued by your skeptics who are also Christians, and I just try to get inside their heads and wonder where they're coming from, or you know what I'm saying? Because
I do.
Okay.
Not only do I know what you're saying, I've actually addressed that issue in writing because over the years I've spoken in Methodist and Lutheran and all the other, many of the Protestant denominations, and I find that it's generally Protestants who are much less likely to be interested in the Shroud than obviously Catholics. Mm-hmm. And I understand why. I mean, there was a Reformation that took place that created the Protestant world, if you will, and that whole purpose was to get away from popes and relics. So I can understand why some Christians are Shroud skeptics. As a matter of fact, that's the name of the article I wrote that was published by Houston Baptist University in their publication and is now available also on shroud.com. It's called 5 Reasons Why Some Christians Are Shroud Skeptics. And it takes those things that are mentioned about the Shroud both in the Gospels and secularly, and it addresses them specifically. And so any of my Christian brothers and sisters that might be listening that are skeptical of the Shroud, look, I understand exactly why, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all, but you might want to read the article that I wrote that addresses those 5 major reasons, and I learned those reasons from Christians themselves who came up to me and would say, look, it says in the Gospels that there was a second cloth, and the Shroud is only one cloth, so it can't be real. And I always say, well, over 2,000 years, it's possible those 2 cloths might have gotten separated. Mm-hmm. One was the face cloth that was put on him on the cross as they brought him down, and then removed to put him in the Shroud after they prepared the body. But because it contained blood and body fluids, it had to be buried with the body. That second cloth still exists. It's in Spain. In Oviedo, Spain, it's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And you can actually see photographs of that on shroud.com as well. That was the second cloth that was mentioned in the Gospels. I'm not sure how that would disqualify the Shroud, but that's one of the reasons. And the other thing is the man has long hair. And I think it was Paul in his letter to, come on now, I'm not a biblical scholar.
The Ephesians?
Corinthians.
Corinthians, okay.
Paul in Corinthians wrote, chastising the men of Corinth for adorning their long hair. And so people read that as forbidding long hair. So I always point out to people, and here's the critical point on that issue. When was that written? It was written by Paul 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Those rules that were created after Jesus didn't apply to Jesus. He followed the rules of the Old Testament.
Laws of Moses.
Which forbid men to trim their side locks and their beards and their hair. And so he followed the rules of Moses, the laws of Moses. That's correct. So although you're right, it does chastise the men for long hair and for adorning their long hair, that wasn't written until 20 years after Jesus was crucified. And so it didn't apply to him. So that's not a valid reason for discounting the shroud. So those are two of the 5 reasons already that we've discussed. And the bottom line is this. You know, I'm not on a crusade here to convince people of anything. I'm not keeping score, and it's not a competition. So all I can do is I can present the evidence, and then I can say, now, make up your own mind. Yeah. To me, that approach, which I've been doing since the first day of the website, I've come to realize that was probably one of the smartest things I've done in my life, is not to take a point of view, but to provide all the evidence so that anybody can study the evidence and make up their own minds. I think that is why we've been successful.
And, you know, the truth, the simple truth is, look, I don't care where you come from along the theological spectrum, or even if you're not on one. The Shroud of Turin is either the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, or it isn't. Those are the only two. That's it.
Yeah, there really is no other. And when you look at it, when you look at the science behind it, when you look at what's recorded on that cloth, you realize that this isn't anything like any artwork ever done by any artist in the history of art. There's nothing like it. There are, you know, aspects of the image that no artist could create.
The evidence, in my view, and I believe you would agree, Barry, the evidence to this point says that, yes, as amazing as it is to believe that this is the burial shroud of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, is that your assessment?
I say those exact words time and again, that is what I believe, that this is the burial shroud of the historic Jesus.
See, that's an amazing thing. Now, I have 2 more questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
One will be easy and one maybe not.
Okay.
So I'll ask the hard one first.
Please.
What is your best guess, your best estimation on how this image was formed?
Well, that's actually an easy one to answer.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea.
Okay.
That's easy. You thought that was a hard question? Really? Okay. Okay, William. No, look, that's the whole point. And that's part of ultimately what convinced me. You know, after studying the data and having access to it, obviously, from the first day, and having seen the cloth up close and personal for such an extended period, unlike most people alive on the planet today, look, I went in there a total skeptic at the beginning, even stupidly saying, give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint and come home. Well, like I said, it's 39 years later. There was no paint, and we're still studying this, and we still don't, you know, for all the study that's been done, and this is probably now the most studied artifact in history, we still aren't any closer to an answer as to how that image was caused. There are still plenty of theories about it. As a matter of fact, there's a conference coming up in Washington State in mid-July where a bunch of scientists are getting together and trying to come up with some kind of a theory that might answer the question. But you got to remember that many of the world-renowned shroud scholars whose work appears on our website, they're dead. And we need a new generation of researchers to sort of pick up the ball from where we left it and carry it further down the road using and applying more modern technology. Until that occurs, however, we're going to be stuck with only the data that we have. And, you know, that's pretty weather-worn now. It's been, you know, evaluated countless times over the last 40 years or so. And, you know, there's a limit to how much one can extract, even with newer technologies, without going back and re-examining the shroud in a similar manner to what we did in 78, but doing so using the most modern, non-destructive technologies we have today.
Yeah, I mean, we know what it's not. You know, we know it's not a medieval forgery. We know what, you know what I'm saying? We know what it isn't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
well, and that's, you know, that's sort of the conclusion of our team, that we can tell you what it's not. It's not a painting. It's not a photograph. It's not a scorch. But we have no idea what mechanism can create an image with these chemical and physical properties.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so maybe the question that I thought was easy may be difficult, but it can't be. So, listen, I know that Shroud.com is one of the oldest bookmarks I have on my laptop.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I've had it bookmarked since even before you and I were on the air together the first time several years ago.
Right.
Shroud.com is the place where people need to go to find out all the latest updates. Now, I know I get updates, so people can subscribe and get email updates, or tell people what they need to do.
Sure. We don't like to send out too many emails. I mean, I get several hundred every day, and so I know what spam is like, and we don't want to be that way. So we have a self-subscribed list. We don't put you on the list. If you want to be on our list, you have to subscribe, and that's not a hard thing to do. It costs nothing, and the only information we need is an email address. You don't have to put your name in or any other information about yourself. And what we'll do is we'll send you an email update when the website is updated, which happens about 4 times a year. So, and if something important occurs in between, then we may send another email. So if you sign up for our mailing list, which you can do, we have a page called send us email or sign up for our mailing list. Just go to that page, stick your email address into that, hit the submit button, and that's all you need to do from that point on. And then you'll get that email from us when the site is updated or some news breaks, like maybe they announce another public exhibition or something. That would prompt us to send a special email. So that's all you have to do. You'll find that Shroud.com has a search engine that searches only within Shroud.com, because anybody can Google anything they want. And generally, if you Google something on the Shroud, it's going to send you to Shroud.com anyway. But you can use the internal search engine that searches only within the website, and that will help you find things very quickly within the site, because it's gotten so huge after 21 years of my updating it 4 times a year or more, that it's monstrous. I had to put the search engine on it so I could find the stuff I'd put there. I couldn't find it anymore. It got so big, and I knew it was there somewhere, but I couldn't find it. So the search engine was our solution. But it also makes it easy for you to find something specific about the Shroud if you're looking for something specific. And that's it. I mean, we are a 501c3. We also can provide a tax-deductible receipt for anyone who wishes to contribute to us. We don't do a lot of fundraising. We have once a year, at the end of the year, we'll remind people that we're a nonprofit and that we would appreciate their support. But during the rest of the year, unlike some nonprofits that are hitting you up for donations every time they send you something, we don't do that. I mean, we feel that this is not about that. It's the contributions and the lectures I do and things of that nature that keep the website free of advertising. There's no ads on our website. And remember, we're international, we're cross-cultural. An ad that you and I might find to be innocuous might be offensive to somebody in a different country and in a different culture. And so the simple solution is not to allow advertising on the site. We can make a lot of money. We had over 100,000 visitors in December. We're over 100,000 in January, and we're looking like we're going to do it again this month. So we're looking at 900,000 to 1 million visitors a year. And so we can make a lot of money if we had ads on our website. But the subject matter just doesn't allow me to do that. You know, it's never been about the money for me. For the first 14 years of the website, I paid for it out of my own pocket. Now the nonprofit handles that, but it's also the owner of the website and all my photography. So the whole idea of Shroud.com is to provide you, the audience, the people out there to whom this is important, a resource where you can go and you can study what we know about the Shroud. You can see the data. You can see the science. You can read the more recent work that's being done. So it's a place where, for those that are really interested in the Shroud, it's kind of a one-stop shopping. You can go to Shroud.com and pretty much find everything you're looking for in that one website.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up the show. And like I told you at the top, one of the most intriguing artifacts in the history of mankind, one of the most important archaeological items, objects in all of history. We're talking about the burial shroud of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, who I don't know, how to put this in the proper context, but I mean, clearly one of the most important individuals to ever walk the face of the earth. And so you need to go ahead.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you just to say, and that's true of whatever your religious persuasion is.
Of course, right. It's.
I mean, his life has more impact on the world today than even in his own time.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah. So
without a doubt.
Anyway, I was just agreeing with you.
Very good. But no, and also, we want to thank Mr. Barry Schwartz for joining us. And, I've been on the air with him a few times over the years, and it's something that I always enjoy. We have to do this every now and again to kind of rekindle the excitement of this issue. I want to remind you guys that you can listen to the Shadowland radio show and the other shows that are produced by Blackwater Media on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. You can also hear these programs on Pinterest and Google Plus and on the Blackwater Media Facebook page. Be sure to listen this weekend for a new edition of Pen and Ink, our new podcast on poetry. Now, Barry, what I'd like you to do is kind of hold the line once we're off the air, so I can just talk to you briefly.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Can I quickly throw in one little statement at the very end here?
Oh, absolutely. Throw it in.
Go Falcons.
Let me tell you something. That is not a small thing you just said there.
I know.
We are. We're doing the show. We are recording the show on the precipice of Super Bowl 51. Atlanta Falcons versus the New England Patriots coming up on Sunday, February the 5th. And so Barry Schwartz's clearly stated support for the Atlanta Falcons has been duly recorded and greatly appreciated. Thank you for falling on the right side of this issue.
Well, the Patriots beat my Steelers, so I'm rooting for the Falcons.
Oh, that's right. You're from Pittsburgh originally.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
So, it will be. It's a lot of excitement about that, and so I.
Well, I couldn't not say that considering you're an Atlanta-based radio show.
Exactly, Atlanta-based, Atlanta-born, Atlanta-bred. So obviously we are greatly anticipating that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the show. And as always, I promise that I will see each and every one of you again on the flip side.